On Uncut with Lucia today, we have the author Mark Sloan. Mark is an independent researcher, and I was looking forward to talking with you. So, welcome, Mark.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I've got my nice hot coffee in the afternoon. Keep the brain cells moving quickly. I'm excited for our talk.
Why did you become an independent researcher?
My journey into health research began after I lost my mother to cancer when I was 12 years old. Um, at the time, I think I was just so traumatized from it and so destroyed that I kind of naturally sought out solutions. So ever since then, I had been reading like mainly self-help and nutrition books, which I really like because you can apply them like right away and figure out if the author's telling you the truth or not. And around 15 years after her death, it was when I really had kind of this revelation, a defining moment in my life. I had been talking to people about my story and kind of just really opened up about it because it took a long time to even be able to talk about it without getting like choked up because it was so emotional at the time. But I realized, this story that I had was very compelling. And when I spoke it, people listened and they heard it. And it gave them a platform to also be vulnerable. And it ended up, whenever I talked about my mother's death, I realized, it ended up in some really great conversations. So I realized I need to share this story. I got a golden ticket here. And, and I was like, you know what? Nobody's solving cancer. I went through this horrible situation and I kind of came out the other side. I'm starting to feel better at that point. And I was like, you know what? I want to make sure no child has to go through what I did. So I basically committed to doing some research on cancer, reading everything that was available and writing a book on it and sharing that with the world. I realized that was the greatest honor I could possibly give to my mother. And I made one of my purposes in life to ensure that no child has to go through what I did ever again. So I got to work, and I think in total I read definitely well over 10,000 scientific and clinical studies. And in my book, which actually ended up being two books on cancer, there's almost 4,000 scientific and clinical references made simple so that anybody can understand it. And the whole purpose of it, like my work, is an invitation for people to question things and think for themselves and draw their own conclusions based on the evidence that's out there. And I knew I was either going to finish this book or these books or die trying. And if I did finish it, it'd be the best book ever written on the subject. And it even exceeded my expectations. No more work and research needs to be done on cancer ever again in order for us to put this disease behind us forever, is what I ultimately realized. And now, for the first time ever, all the information one needs to make that happen and to never die of cancer and to lose their fear of it completely, because it's not what we're told it is to read these two books. So it's never been more simple. And I feel like, at the end of life, when I stand before the creator and he asked me, what did you do to try to make the world a better place? Well, this is definitely one of my biggest accomplishments and attempts to improve this world that we live in.
Yeah, and it will be an amazing story that you will be able to tell your kids, and they will be very proud of you. And Mark, can you tell us a little bit about your mom?
Yeah, so when I was 11, that was when she received her diagnosis, and it was cervical cancer. And what doctors saw that led to the diagnosis was a small, very tiny lesion on her cervix, about the size of a baby fingernail, and not very big at all. But they wanted to go in. They said, we got to cut this thing out in a couple of weeks. We got to rush her in or she's going to die. And when she's in there, we're going to apply some radiotherapy, make sure it doesn't come back. And my dad at the time specifically sought out like some of the best doctors in all of Canada. So, myself and my sister, we were really surprised by it, but I didn't really understand what cancer was at the time. All I knew is she was sick and that my dad got the best help. He sought the best help that he could find. And so I felt pretty good about it. She's gonna come back. We're gonna get our mother back. And then returned to the hospital because there were cutbacks, so she had to wait a bit longer than normal. But when she went for a checkup at 6 months, doctor said, we found the cancer had metastasized and we found some more in her hip area. So now we want to use chemotherapy and we need to rush her in for this again, or she's going to die in like a couple weeks here. So things got serious, and I noticed this time around my dad wasn't quite as hopeful. I think inside, I mean, I remember reading books when I was like 10. There was a book in the washroom called like on medicinal herbs. So I could tell my dad was kind of like in tune with this stuff. He realized, injecting poison into someone's probably not a good idea. So I don't think he was feeling too good about that. But the doctor, they scare you into this. So he, like many, was over like, okay, we'll get her in. The sooner we get her in, the better, apparently. And after that treatment, it was almost like she got hit by a truck. Like um, the difference of my mother before chemotherapy and after was like night and day. She had some of the most horrendous side effects I've ever seen. Like basically her legs, like the upper part of her legs swelled up um, probably 2 or 3 times the size. So she could no longer walk. So we had to push her around in a wheelchair. She couldn't eat solid foods, which is due to a side effect called trismus, which affects the jaw. They call it lockjaw. It's just a better name. I don't understand where they come with these crazy terms like trismus, but she couldn't swallow, couldn't eat, could barely speak, and was in a wheelchair, like I said. And then probably the worst of all was just the constant pain. I remember laying in bed at night at age 12, and she was downstairs because she couldn't sleep. And we could hear her like crying downstairs, but trying to be quiet, like whimpering because she wanted to help let her kids and family sleep upstairs. But so day and night, nonstop pain. And that continued for the next 3 months. And then she died at the end of that 3 months. So she got chemotherapy and died 3 months later. One of the questions that I think was probably going through all of our minds, but nobody, I guess, was courageous enough to ask it was, was it the cancer that killed our mother or was it the chemotherapy? And that is actually the question that I wanted to solve in my first book called The Cancer Industry. And so that one's out there. It's a bestseller on Amazon right now. And I think if you breathe air, you need to read this book because it goes through, it has a chapter on surgery, a chapter on chemotherapy, a chapter on radiotherapy, and a chapter on cancer screening tests. And I would say this, without reading that book and the information in it, you can't make an informed decision about whether or not you want these treatments. The doctors are always going to say it's beneficial. It's all they know, really, and all they've ever seen. And there's a really good case to be made that you don't ever want to get these things. I know I will never get them myself, but that's up to you as the listener to decide. But you can only decide and make an informed decision about you personally if you inform yourself. And the easiest possible way to do that is reading my book, The Cancer Industry.
And Mark, why are we getting so many cases of cancer?
Well, yeah, this is the 50th year, 50th anniversary since the war on cancer was declared, 2021. It's a very special year and a very special year, a great time for my work to shine, I would say as well. And a great time to step back and say, hey, what have they done for us here? They promised us a cure for cancer, the US government 50 years ago, if we would support their establishments with donations. And what are the results? Well, $500 billion estimated have been spent on cancer research since then. And according to official statistics from the National Cancer Institute, more people are diagnosed and dying of the disease than ever before. And so my question to you is, what do you do when you give someone $500 billion to solve a problem in 50 years and they come up with nothing? Well, you fire them and you find another way. So that, again, is also the purpose of my book, The Cancer Industry. As far as why so many people are being diagnosed, there's many, many reasons for that. You could look at like the food supply, just the quality of food has kind of declined quite a bit ever since, I would say since the end of World War II, when like monocrop agriculture started to take over and which started replacing like the family farm, which generally didn't poison their food. That's one reason. Another reason, and another reason to read my book on the cancer industry, are the cancer screening tests themselves. So it turns out the two major screening tests, the one for men is the PSA test, which screens for prostate cancer. And the big one for women is mammography, which screens for breast cancer. And I don't know if this is a coincidence or not. I can only speculate, but both of them tend to massively overdiagnose people. So since, for example, since mammography was put into use in the 1970s, there's been a study on this that showed over 1 million women have been falsely diagnosed with cancer and treated for cancer simply because of the test. So basically, over 1 million women who would never have experienced any symptoms at all because they didn't have cancer were told they have cancer and then treated for it. And because the treatments are so horrendous, many of the women were actually killed by that because of a screening test that tends to overdiagnose. So that is what I would call a public health disaster right there. And the PSA test is no different. That one was put into use in the early 1990s. And there was a study by Dr. Gilbert Welch that I reference in the book that showed, I think it was like over 1.3 million men who didn't have prostate cancer were told they had prostate cancer because of that test. Those incidences would not have occurred without it. He said it looks more like a stock market graph than a graph of cancer diagnosis. So there's another big reason why there's so many people diagnosed, because these tests tend to overdiagnose, which, like I said, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but that's also very profitable for the cancer industry. So perhaps it isn't a coincidence, and that's just a good business move to have a diagnostic test that overdiagnoses, because it makes them a lot more money. So I don't know either way, but what we do know is that the tests are quite the disaster and diagnosing a lot of people with cancer who don't actually have it.
Mhm. Also, mammograms, if you do it once a year, it has a lot of radiation, yeah? And
Yeah,
radiation
absolutely.
can cause cancer.
Yeah, Dr. Samuel Milham, he says that one single mammogram, the radiation that comes off of that is the equivalent of 1,000 chest x-rays. So there's an enormous amount of radiation coming off or being administered to the breast. And if you don't already have cancer, well, we know the ionizing radiation is carcinogenic. So it just doesn't make sense to use that. And there's very good case to be made that mammograms and routine use of them is not justified. In fact, that was actually the conclusion of a scientific review in the early 2000s about mammography.
Mark, do you believe that stress also can cause cancer?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. I think stress is really literally at the root cause of all diseases, and understanding kind of how it manifests and why that is I think taking it to the next level. That's what I like about my work. So when it comes to stress, the two main players, the two main hormones that are elevated when someone's under stress are adrenaline and cortisol. And these hormones tend to switch off thyroid function, which then lowers your metabolism. And that in turn is basically the cause of everything, all the diseases out there, including cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, heart disease, dementia, on and on and on. Almost every single disease and pathology that people commonly suffer from today are caused by a dysfunctional metabolism, which is always accompanied by the hypothyroidism. And the hypothyroidism is very quickly induced in the body when the person is under stress. So yeah, absolutely. I think stress plays a critical component in that, which is why one of the targets of any kind of good medicine is our cortisol and adrenaline. So there's actually some anti-adrenaline, anti-cortisol drugs in the pharmaceutical industry. And although there are very few pharmaceuticals that I would say are actually very beneficial, those are definitely some of them. Methylene blue is another, and I just wrote a book on that. But yeah, stress is definitely at the core of disease, in my opinion.
Can you explain the red light therapy efficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Raymond Pete has said that red and near infrared light are probably the primary anti-stress factors for all organisms. Red light therapy has been studied for around 100 years now scientifically, and it's been proven effective for literally dozens of diseases and conditions. Even the most recent phenomenon, the COVID virus, for example, there was a doctor, I think it's Massachusetts, Dr. Scott Sigman in Massachusetts. He published a couple case studies at the end of the year 2020 on COVID patients that he treated using red light therapy. And the results were very surprising. But even more surprising is that we haven't really heard about that. That should be on like the front page news. But here are the details of those studies. One was a 57-year-old African-American man. He had severe COVID infection. And when he was admitted to the ICU, he couldn't even walk. And I think one of the primary things that happens to people with COVID is like respiratory distress. So they get like damaged air sacs in their lungs due to inflammation. And then they have a hard time exchanging gases. So they don't have a lot of oxygen. And so you want to repair those damaged air sacs. Studies have shown that red light can indeed do that, reduce the inflammation and repair that damage. But this particular patient, Dr. Sigmund treated him 4 treatments, 4 days in a row, 1 treatment per day, using an MLS laser, which is a red light and near infrared light laser. Costs like $30,000. But after the 4th day of treatment, he literally did 2 sets of stairs. And he was admitted to the hospital. He couldn't even walk, and now all of a sudden he's walking stairs. So in only 4 days, he was back on his feet. The median recovery time for somebody with COVID is like 8 weeks, and he was fully recovered in 3. So I don't know at what point you draw the line between, treatment and cure, but that's about as close as it gets, I think. It seems to be a very, very effective option for COVID. And speaking of that, my most recent book, I published it last month on methylene blue. That's also been studied for COVID as well. In March 2020, a Chinese study came out testing methylene blue on COVID, and they found that it, and I quote, deactivated the COVID virus in literally 2 seconds. So almost immediately they came up with research showing that methylene blue is effective for it. And then that research was followed up on later in the year, and many people from many other countries in different labs reported the exact same thing. So it's another very promising modality for that. And also, when you combine red light therapy and methylene blue, they call it photodynamic therapy. It seems to be one of the most potent treatment combinations for pretty much every disease that I've seen and researched. So it's a very promising way to go, is using red light therapy. Putting a little bit of methylene blue into your favorite juice or water, drinking it, and then sitting under the sun or under a red light therapy device is literally one of the best things you could do, I think, for pretty much every disease when you're trying to recover.
And this is easy to, like someone like me, I can just buy these products, or should my doctor prescribe it to me?
I think your doctor would definitely say you should go to him. But I mean, there are lots of red light therapy devices available online at very cheap prices too. It's like 1/30th or more of the price of like a laser. This is the beautiful thing about the development of LED lights, is that it took red light therapy from a price that almost nobody could afford, like $30,000, to as little as like $100. So for $100, you can get a device that you can sit under at home. And methylene blue is a very inexpensive medicinal blue dye. And depending on what grade you get, it's widely available online as well. And that's one of the beautiful things about this time we're living in, is that all the products, all the medicines that appear to be the best and also the safest generally are all available, and they're widely available to us and easily obtainable now that the internet's here.
You said that cancer is a metabolic disease. Can you explain?
Yeah, so the mainstream theory of cancer is that it's a genetic disease whereby a cell turns irreversibly mutated into like some kind of monster-like creature that's trying to kill the patient. But the underlying theory on that is that it is genetic. And this has been disproven for a long time. The evidence for this has been mounting for decades and decades. For example, studies, I think it was in the 70s, I referenced this in my book accurately, but the one study was done on rats where they took cells from a rat brain tumor and then they cloned another rat from it. And so the idea is, like, if genetics and damaged genes cause cancer, then you would expect that cloned rat from damaged cancer cell DNA would grow up with tumors and not be quite right. But it turns out that didn't happen. And the cloned rat, and it showed that the cloned rat grew up healthy without tumors or cancer at all. And it basically showed that damaged cancer DNA can direct normal development. So that's one study that suggests cancer is not genetic. But the biggest one of all was actually from the National Cancer Institute itself. In the early 2000s, the National Cancer Institute launched the Cancer Genome Atlas Project. And this multi-billion-dollar medical behemoth of an initiative, they basically wanted to find out which mutation or sequence of mutations cause each type of cancer. So in order to get prostate cancer, this gene, and this gene need to be mutated, and you get prostate cancer. That's kind of what they were hoping for. And then they could develop drugs that would switch on and off each gene. However, it didn't happen that way at all. In fact, the results show that it was a complete and utter failure. They looked at cells from the same tumor in different people. So two different people diagnosed with the same type of cancer. And they found the mutational signatures in the cells were entirely different. They looked at two different cells from the same tumor in the same person, and they found that they were completely different, and the genetic mutations seem to appear almost completely at random. And they even looked at like a metastatic cell, which is a cell that's broken free from a tumor and floats through the blood to colonize elsewhere in the body. And that too was completely different than the genetic mutations found in the original tumor. So time and time again, the National Cancer Institute's own project, the Cancer Genome Atlas Project, showed that not one mutation or any series of mutations were entirely responsible for initiating the disease. So this project proved once and for all that cancer is not a genetic disease. And the founder of the human genome, sorry, his name right now escapes me, but he even responded to these initial findings publicly, saying that we should switch our aim with cancer research from genetics to metabolism. And he had it right. He realizes that cancer is a metabolic disease, which means a cancer cell is a cell in which the inner workings of it is having a difficult time producing energy. So it's just a defective cell that isn't producing adequate energy for itself to remain healthy, or for the person to remain healthy. So that's simply all it is. And in short, you could just call that a damaged cell, because that's exactly what happens when the metabolism breaks down. There's an increase in free radical production and or reactive oxygen species in the cell. And that in turn damages the interior components of the cell. And now the cell must revert to a more primitive means of metabolism, which is fermenting glucose. So long story short, yes, cancer is a metabolic disease. It's not a genetic one, which is really amazing, because we're always told, you know, if somebody in our family has been diagnosed with cancer, that you're at increased risk of it. Well, what this says is that that's not the case at all. If you eat the same food as them and have the same environment as them, it's like, yeah, maybe you are at the same increased risk of cancer, but it's not a genetic disease. Genes have literally nothing to do with it.
Excellent. Mark, can you show us your book, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've written 5 books to date. I've got my first 2, the ones on cancer, which is what we're speaking about now. Here is The Cancer Industry. That's my first book. And this will go through all the cancer treatments and diagnostic tests. And there are like 600 scientific references in that. And yeah, it's a very important read. My second book on cancer is called Cancer, the Metabolic Disease Unraveled. In that, I go through the genetic theory and why cancer isn't genetic. So I show what cancer isn't. Then I show what it is and what's actually happening inside the body of a person with cancer. And then I give numerous examples of treatments and therapies that basically show you the most efficient way how to reverse the actual problem that's happening. So it's a very complete in and of itself. I might write a third one at some point and just kind of boil it down, make it real simple, and complete the trilogy.
You also have a book about the red light therapy.
Yeah, I've written a book also, another bestseller on Amazon called Red Light Therapy, Miracle Medicine. After these cancer books, I realized, you know, now that we're realizing that it's been proven scientifically that surgery, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy do far more harm than good, and that people are far better off doing nothing. I was like, okay, we got a void now. It's like, what are people going to replace these with? You need confidence in other alternatives that are out there. So I decided to write some books on alternatives. That's what I've been focusing on my past 3 books. So red light therapy is one of them. Another one is balneotherapy, which is bathing in mineral-rich carbonated water. like in a natural hot spring or in a simulated natural hot spring in your own bathtub at home. And that book focuses on how to make the most medicinal bath possible and gives you all the ingredients to make that happen. So it's really exciting. It also comes with a very exciting history of the use of medicinal baths for health. That used to be literally the number one modality for treating every single disease in Western medicine, all the way up until 1940. Almost nobody knows about that. So it's a really fascinating read. I think people will love that, especially if you're into baths. And my most recent book is on methylene blue therapy, which is another fascinating read. It's originally developed for the textile industry to dye fabric. Turns out this blue dye has a lot more going for it than just the ability to dye fabric. It's probably the most promising book. If you're looking for solutions, I think these three books are the best you'll ever find out there. And I hope you enjoy them as much as I enjoyed writing them.
Well, excellent work that you're doing, Mark. And I believe that our listeners are going to be curious to read your books. And yeah, excellent. And keep doing this beautiful work you're doing. And thank you very much for your time here with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.